In the name of God, we want to continue our discussion about the problem of cross-linguistic typology. Recognition of the problem of cross-linguistic comparability and its solution has led to the formulation of a standard research strategy for typological research. Number 1. Determine the particular semantic or pragmatic structure or situation type that one is interested in studying. 2. Examine the morphosyntactic constructions or strategies used to encode the situation type. 3. Search for dependencies between the constructions used for the situation and other linguistic factors, other structural features, other structural functions expressed by the construction in question or both. This solution to the problem of cross-linguistic comparability implies a close relationship between form and external function. Typological classification, the descriptive prerequisite to typological generalization and explanation, requires a cross-linguistic analysis of the relationship between linguistic form and function. Since this is a controversial point in contemporary linguistic theory, it is worth examining the problem more closely. Many grammatical categories are identified cross-linguistically by semantic means without significant objection. Many grammatical categories are identified cross-linguistically by semantic means without significant objection. For instance, if one is trying to find out if a set of verbal suffixes represents tense or aspect, one examines their meaning and use, not any formal properties. In these categories, difficulties in cross-linguistic comparability arise chiefly when a single form combines multiple functions, as often happens. The main problematic categories for cross-linguistic identification are the fundamental grammatical categories: noun, verb, an adjective, subject, an object, head and modifier, argument and adjunct, main clause and subordinate clause, and etc. Needless to say, these categories are central to linguistic theory. Noun, verb, adjective, subject, object, head, modifier. These categories, they are central to linguistic theory. On the one hand, these categories do not have an obvious functional, semantic, or pragmatic definition. On the other hand, these grammatical categories and the categories defined by them do vary considerably in their structural expressions across languages. Once we have identified the categories cross-linguistically by semantic pragmatic means. The problem of cross-linguistic identification shouldn't be overstated. In most cases, it is not difficult to identify the basic grammatical categories on an intuitive basis. The problem of cross-linguistic identification shouldn't be overstated. In most cases, it is not difficult to identify the basic grammatical categories on an intuitive basis. To a great extent, this is accomplished by examining the translation of a sentence and its part, which is, of course, the semantic pragmatic method. On the other hand, the weaknesses of an intuitive cross-linguistic identification of categories become apparent when one focuses on an example which is not so intuitively clear after all. For example, is the English gerund verb invoking the dog is a core, a noun, or a verb? To give an idea of how unavoidable considerations of external function are, we will briefly discuss some of the problems involved with a cross-linguistic identification of subject. First, across languages, the grammatical relation of subject is expressed structurally in several different ways. Okay, to give an idea of how unavoidable considerations of external function are, we will briefly discuss some of the problems involved with a cross-linguistic identification of subject. First, across languages, the grammatical relation of subject is expressed structurally in several different ways: by case marking, including adpositions, by indexation, we mean agreement, by word order, or by a combination of both of this. So this means the languages express the subject. Yet, how does one know this in the first place? Only by using a cross-linguistic definition involving external function, including some notion of agent, of an action and topic of a sentence, to determine what is a subject in each language. Now, one must have a cross-linguistic means to identify case, adposition, indexation, or word and word order. Word order appears to be the easiest, since it is clearly based on a physical property of the utterance, the sequence of units which can be directly observed. However, the correct word order analysis requires that the grammatical category of each unit be identified. For example, the assertion that Yoruba subjects can be identified by their positions before the verb requires the identification of the verbs in Yoruba, not to mention noun phrases or at least nouns, and not to mention across linguistic means of individuating syntactic units, a problem that we will not deal with here. A cross-linguistic definition of case or adposition and indexation on a structural basis is difficult as well. Case or adposition markers can be attached to the noun phrase argument, or be independent particles, or even be attached to the verb in some cases. So, syntactic position and dependency cannot be suitable criteria for a cross-linguistic definition. Here you can see the example of each means attachment to subject, which occur in Russian. Here, this nominative singular marker attached to the subject, which it occur in Russian. It means the letter is lying on the table. Another means is independent particle, like in Romanian, which is here, P, which is independent particle, means on. Attachment to the verb here in Michaelas, which means with, letter with his pen. The examples are not important, they just want to clear the matter for us by these examples. Indexation markers mean agreement are syntactically at least as variable. They can be affixes to the verb, independent particles, or attached to the other constituents of a sentence, including the noun phrase, denoting the same reference as an index. Here we can see its example. For example, attachment to the verb which happen is Hungarian, like ank, which show the first person plural, independent particle, like here, which show the third person singular, attachment to the other constituent, like here, which is third person plural, attachment to any constituent including noun phrase, which you can see here, which show the first person singular, which attached to the subject, the pronoun. Thus, morphosyntactic dependence like case marking and subjects, agreement on verbs, will not provide an unproblematic cross-linguistic definition, at least not by itself. A more suitable definition would be that a case marker or adposition is relational, that is, a morpheme that denotes a semantic relation that holds between the noun phrase and the verb, while agreement is indexical, that is, a morpheme that denotes the argument itself. This definition is essentially a semantic one. Okay, I want to repeat it again. Morphosyntactic dependence, like case marking on subject, agreement on verbs, will not provide an unproblematic cross-linguistic definition, at least not by itself. A more suitable definition would be that a case marker or adposition is relational, that is, a morpheme that denotes the semantic relation that holds between the noun phrase and the verb, while agreement is indexical, that is, a morpheme that denotes the argument itself, which this definition is semantic. If we assume a cross-linguistic definition for case marking and indexation that fits our intuitions, then we encounter a larger problem. Our intuitive notion of subject is based on English subjects, or a standard average European subject, to use Wolff's term, especially and the semantic relation between the even denoted by the verb and the participant denoted by the English subject. Examining more exotic languages, we find that what we have identified as the subject by the use of a particular case marking or indexation form doesn't correspond to English subjects, or the English subject doesn't conform to the other language subject. For example, in Chechen English, the English translation subjects of the following three examples display quite different case marking and indexation patterns. Okay, here we can see in this language we have this marker which show nominative and it is collective, means the child is crying. They show them in this way. Or here this marker which show the first person singular, which attached to the first person singular. I'm reading this book, and this which show the collective. The collective indexes a child here in this example. Here indexes the beer, which means child, and the collective indexes book here. This is the collective for book. They are co-index, and here the collective indexes book again. If we identify the subject with the nominative noun phrase that the verb indexes, then this book in the second and the third sentences is the subject. If we treat the ergative and or dative noun phrase as subject, then the first sentence appears not to have a subject. Whatever solution is taken to this problem must refer to the actual semantic relations that hold between the subject and the verb. Thus, a cross-linguistically valid definition of subject referring to external properties is unavoidable. It is possible to develop cross-linguistic definitions of grammatical categories that are partially structural in nature. Many grammatical constructions are defined in terms of the basic grammatical categories whose difficulties in cross-linguistic identification we have discussed: subject, noun, verb, etc. If these basic categories can be identified across languages by external definitions, one may develop derived structural definitions for the construction in question. For example, the passive construction can be defined as one in which the subject of the passive verb is the object of the counterpart active verb. This is a structural definition of the passive that can be used for cross-linguistic identification. Once one has already identified subject, verb, object, and the active construction on external grounds. The choice of a purely external versus a derived structural definition of a construction depends on the purposes of a typological study. Okay, the choice of a purely external versus a derived structural definition of a construction depends on the purposes of the typological study. For example, we may compare external and derived structural definitions for the subjunctive. An external definition is that the situation denoted by the subjunctive clause is non-factual or irrealist modality. A derived structural definition is that the subjunctive clause is a clause which, one, expresses the subject and the object of the clause in the same way as an ordinary declarative main clause does, but two, whose verb inflections differ from those of the verb in an ordinary declarative main clause. Condition 1 is intended to distinguish the subjunctive from various types of non-finite clauses, and condition 2 is intended to distinguish the subjunctive from the indicative. The external definition would be more useful in a typological study of modality. Definition has proved more useful in studies of complex sentence structure. Not all externally based definitions are created equal. For example, in seeking a cross-linguistically valid definition of subject, one would not use translation equivalents of expressions such as the lightning struck the tree or I like bananas. One would more likely use expressions like I broke the stick or he killed the goat. A priori, there is no reason to select the latter two as better for defining subject than the former two. In either case, one determines the grammatical relation of the relevant predicate argument relation and identifies it as a subject. Nevertheless, our pre-theoretic intuitions about grammatical categories strongly suggest that Some external definitions are better cross-linguistic criteria than others, and detailed analysis of the relevant linguistic phenomena generally bear out those intuitions. Hence, we use physical actions with animate agents for defining subject, the relationship of ownership for defining possession, and so on. Of course, these choices are based on pre-theoretic intuition and may turn out to be incorrect. For example, many linguists, like Foltz in 1978, used the recipient of the verb give as the defining environment for the dative, but others have argued that in many languages give is syntactically a very atypical transitive verb. Selection of give always requires cross-checking with a variety of other verbs of similar valency. Reliance on single exemplars can lead to building a typological generalization on too narrow an empirical base. What matters are the cross-linguistic facts. The best external definitions are those that yield categories with a more consistent coding across languages and more consistent grammatical behavior. In fact, a cross-linguistic study must be somewhat broad in semantic range in order to discover the best cross-linguistic definition. In phonology, the problem of cross-linguistic comparison also arises. The cross-linguistic identification of English P with Russian P is based primarily on their articulatory acoustic similarity, that is, their external phonetic values. Also, to argue that a category P participate in a typological pattern involving a hierarchy of stops including T and K, presumably means that the articulatory gestures or acoustic features involved in P are related to those involved in T in such a way as to manifest the linguistic behavior which led us to postulate the hierarchy in the first place. It is difficult to see how one could use any other criterion, because there may be no obvious way to identify anything in the alternative phonemic system with English P, because of differences between the other phonemic system and the English system. For example, if the language is Hindi, which distinguishes between aspirated P and unaspirated P, the whole phonemic system is different, and so it would be impossible to identify English P with Hindi P on the basis of the phonemic system, because one is aspirated and another one is not. And aspiration is phonemic in Hindi and is allophonic in English. The problem is, it is extremely difficult to gauge which Hindi phoneme the English P should be identified with phonetically. Most allophones of the English P are quite aspirated like Hindi P, but those allophones don't contrast with phoneme P, unlike Hindi, which is phonemic. Most phonological typological studies have involved the analysis of phoneme inventories, making generalization based, for example, on 5-vowel system versus 7-vowel system. However, phonetically, not all 7-vowel systems are alike. The individual vowels differ acoustically, and this is generally true for all phonological segments. In a typological approach to phonology, one must also do cross-linguistic comparison on the basis of the relationship between the linguistic system and its external or phonetic manifestation. A language sampling for cross-linguistic research. There are approximately 6,000 languages in the world today. The majority of them are not documented at all, or have only minimal documentation. Of the rest, documentation varies substantially in quality, even though there are hundreds of languages for which good documentation is available. If one is examining a phenomenon which is exhibited in only a relatively limited number of languages, such as impulsive or numeral classifiers, then one can examine virtually all attested examples. For example, in his study of glottic consonant, Greenberg in 1970 used a sample of 150 languages, which was virtually exhaustive at time for impulsive, not for ejective. But in most cases, the available documentation is far greater than can be handled in most realistic typological studies. Hence, typologists must use a subset of these languages in studying cross-linguistic variation. That is a sample. Okay. Hence, typologists must use a subset of these languages in studying cross-linguistic variation. That is a sample. That subset is a sample. But by using a subset of the world's languages, two methodological problems arise. The first problem is that the sample may not capture all linguistic diversity. Consider, for example, the English passive voice construction. The boy was taken to a school by his parents. Okay, I want to repeat it again. For doing typologically study, we should have a sample. By sample, we mean a subset of these languages in studying cross-linguistic variation. But by using this subset or this sample of the world's languages, we have two methodological problems. One, the sample may not capture all linguistic diversity. For example, here we have the passive voice construction in English. The English passive differs from the English active by the presence of two words, the auxiliary be and the preposition by, as well as the verbal inflection, the passive participle suffix. Other European languages have a structurally identical passives, so one might venture the hypothesis that passives always involve the presence of an auxiliary or preposition governing the agent phrase. In fact, this is not so. Lumi, like many languages, expresses the passive without an auxiliary. This is the exception, simply with the verbal inflection. Here, just the inflection, they show the passive verb, which means you are known by the man, but here we don't have any auxiliary. They do that with the verbal inflection. Bambara represents a much rarer case, a passive without overt marking of the verb form as passive. Here in Bambara, we have the passive sentence, which is expressed without overt marking of the verb form as a passive. Here we had two exceptions of the passive voice. The second problem is that what we think of as a theoretically significant relationship between two grammatical properties may be an accident. For example, it has been suggested that there is a biconditional relationship between the absence of obligatory independent subject pronouns and indexation. The basis for this hypothesis is the fact that English has obligatory subject pronoun but very little indexation, whereas many European languages, so-called pro-drop or null subject languages, don't have obligatory subject pronoun but have rich indexation systems. The difference can be illustrated by comparing the English example and Spanish. In English, we can say that I ate the bread. This is correct. But we cannot say ate the bread. We can delete the subject. This asterisk in syntax shows that this is ill-formed and this is not correct. Here we can omit the subject because subject is obligatory in English. But as you can see in Spanish, we can do that. We can delete the subject and it is correct. Here we have you, which is the subject. In Spanish, we have delete that and it is correct again because it is a pro-drop language. Nevertheless, there exist many languages, in fact more languages than the English type according to one typological survey, that don't have obligatory independent subject pronouns and also don't have indexation. These languages include Japanese, Chinese, Brentless, a list of which is illustrated here. They don't have obligatory independent subject and even they don't have any indexation. Here you can see the example, which its translation is and then split in front of hanger mangema. Here the subject, independent subject pronoun, and its indexation are omitted. These two problems can be addressed by two different types of sample. Okay, these two problems, dear student, you should know all of these details for your final exam. You should know the meaning of sample, the type of sample. You should know what is the problem with the sampling. You should know all of them, but in your summarization you can just define them, and details are not important, but for your final exam they are important. These two problems can be addressed by two different types of samples. A variety samples, we should know their definition. A variety sample and a probability sample. By a variety sample we mean selects a subset that is intended to maximize the likelihood of capturing all the linguistic diversity for the phenomenon under study. I want to repeat it again. By a variety sample we means to select a subset that is intended to maximize the likelihood of capturing of the linguistic diversity for the phenomenon under study. The probability sample selects a sample from the set of languages whose probability of being chosen over another sample is known in advance. You should know these two definitions. That is to say, we know in advance the likelihood of choosing one set of languages over another, and we may therefore ascertain which correlation between traits in a sample chosen are in fact significant. Much research has been conducted on the construction of both variety and proportional samples. We will briefly discuss the issues underlying the construction of such sample here. An important conclusion to be drawn, however, is that one must not lose sight of the original goals of the sampling process. Other solutions besides sampling will allow us to address the problems in capturing diversity and identify significant correlations. The general principles behind a variety sample is that the best way to capture the full range of linguistic variation is to select languages that have evolved independently from each other for a long enough time to have developed different strategies for the grammatical expression of the phenomenon under study. That is, the greater time depth from divergence, the greater likelihood of diversity. Hence, the focus on constructing variety samples has been on selecting languages from different genetic families. And if the sample is large enough to select more than one language from a single genetic family, to select the languages from as distantly related branches in the family as possible. This type of sample is a Koto sample. It means that categorize the languages genetically and choose a fixed number of languages from each category. A method for constructing a variety sample has been developed by Rijikov and colleagues. Rijikov et al. Used the structure of the genetic family tree in order to select languages for a sample. They give examples of samples for varying numbers of languages in the sample. They demonstrate that their method gives similar result whether using a genetic classification recognizing very deep ancient families such as that found in Rulen, or one that doesn't, such as that used by ethnologue. Although in many cases the structure of the family tree is a good stand-in for the relative time depths in divergence of languages, which is problematic in a number of significant cases. The number of branches at each level is the tree determines the diversity value, but the number of branches at each level and as a consequence the number of levels as a function of the intensity of research in a family, how widely a proposed family is accepted, and the choice of competing hypotheses for a family. Also, if one family's branches are much older than another family's branches, then its branches should be weighted more heavily in a variety sample, since its branches have had much more time to diverge typologically. The solution to this problem is calibration of the branching structure by the relative time depths of the branches. Although this has not been accomplished, some subjunctive estimate exists, and it is possible to apply lexico-statistical methods to compare relative time depths. Another factor that must also to be taken into consideration in a variety of samples is to maximize geographical dispersion of the sample because of a real diffusion of typological traits. However, even an improved variety sample doesn't capture a crucial feature of linguistic diversity. A variety sample is designed to capture the range of variation, that is, the most extreme differences in structural type form in the world's languages. For small samples especially, a good variety sample may lead to the impression that the structural types are more discrete than they actually are. But another feature of linguistic diversity is the range of intermediate types between the extreme types. The intermediate types arise in large part because of the gradual nature of language change. Hence, the intermediate types are mostly likely to be found in genetically or geographically closely related languages. Depending on the relative speed of such a change, intermediate types may be quite rare, and since they are likely to be genetically closely related to languages with more common types, they are unlikely to be captured by variety sample. For example, there is great diversity in the voice systems of Salishan languages. The Lumi passive was illustrated above. The patient triggers subject indexation, and the agent is governed by a preposition. The passive is observer halcomelum is slightly different. Here you can see the passive verb of this language, which we show it by M, which show the third person singular, means she was bumped into by the man. The patient is in the subject position. Here, the patient bumped. And this example is this in the subject position, is at the first of the sentence. But triggers a special set of indexation suffixes, while the agent is not governed by a preposition and the verb lacks a distinct passive suffix. Okay, you can see all of them in this example. The bella cola passive is yet another variation. Here you can see that we use im to show the third person singular, and it means that the woman is seen by the man. Here the patient triggers a special set of indexation suffixes like a braver halcomelum, while the agent is governed by a preposition like lumi. In order to capture the full range of linguistic diversity, both the extremes and the intermediate types, one requires both a genetically and a really dispersed variety sample and the examination of closely related languages in family with significant internal diversity. It means that we should draw a continuum for showing them. In identifying significant correlation between grammatical traits such as optional pronouns and agreement, probability samples are necessary. Okay, in identifying significant correlation between grammatical traits such as optional pronouns and agreement, probability samples are necessary. With probability samples, however, the statistical requirements are stricter. The sample must consist of independent occurrences of the combination of traits. In the case of languages, this means strictly independent occurrences of the combination of traits. There are two ways in which occurrences of traits are not strictly independent: because of genetic descent from a common ancestor or through contact. For example, in both Russian and Czech, there is an interesting pair of construction that distinguish expression of location and expressions of motion. The same preposition is used for motion and location, but the locative case is used for location and the accusative case for motion. Here we can see the example in Czech. We use this symbol. I am putting the book on the table, which they show on Vizne, with this particle, and here we have another particle and indexation. In Russian it is different. I put the book on the table. It means the book are lying on the table with these different tools. On the basis of this evidence, one might propose that if a language uses both adposition and case affixes for indicating grammatical relation, then the case affixes will be used to distinguish motion from location. However, the resemblance between Russian and Czech illustrated here is clearly the result of common inheritance. The actual morphology is cognate, and this same distinction is found in Old Church Slavonic, generally considered to be close to the common Slavic parent language of Czech and Russian. Thus, the two occurrences of the phenomena in Russian and Czech are not strictly independent. It is just a single occurrence in a single language, Common Slavic, that happens to have survived into the daughter languages, Czech and Russian. Okay, I think this is enough until the genetic relatedness. Please look at this video many times to get the point and summarize this session, and you should know the details for a final exam. And for summarization, just mention those matter who are bold and they are defined in this session. Thank you.